This week's module looks at two different ideologies that developed during the 19th century, nationalism and imperialism. The first would lead to transformations in the balance of power in Europe with the establishment of important new states, while the latter brought Europeans into contact with the world and permitted their domination over Africans and Asians, thanks mainly to the power of industrialization and the motivations of nationalism. The unification of Italy was one of the first successful nationalist movements. After the failure in 1848 to establish a single Italian state, leaders in the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia embraced the populist movement of nationalism as a way of expanding the power of Italian states in order to compete with the more established states of France, Britain, and Austria. However, the intervention of elites meant that unification came not from a popular revolution, but rather from a series of diplomatic moves that pushed out the foreign leaders in the southern part of the peninsula. The unification of the Italian state was completed by 1870, thanks in large part to a series of small European wars. While Italian unification was important, it was the unification of Germany that truly changed the landscape of Europe. Influenced by the role of Piedmont in the creation of Italy, Prussian leaders embraced German nationalism as a way to increase influence in Central Europe. The German unification, which was a populist movement as well, was co-opted by Prussia, which was in competition with Austria over influence in the German states. While Austria rejected nationalism as a viable ideology, Prussians, even conservative ones, saw value in using it to bring together the German states. Much like in the case of Italy, diplomacy and warfare were central to its success. This tension developed over the liberals' desire to reduce the influence of the Junkers in the German military. Liberals wanted an army that would be loyal to the Prussian state rather than to the elites. Military reform included a citizens' army, which upset the Junkers who wanted to keep their influence over the army. As part of the constitution, the legislature, known as the Reichstag, controlled finances, and they planned to end funding to the army as a method of forcing change. This tactic set off a constitutional crisis that led the Kaiser to turn to an ally, Otto von Bismarck, who was appointed as prime minister in 1862. Bismarck was successful in undermining the liberal position through a combination of censorship and vote suppression in order to establish a more pliant Reichstag. More importantly, Bismarck used an anti-Austrian policy through his vocal support of nationalism and unification to make his administration more popular among Prussian people. Bismarck had to keep this popularity up through action and embarked on a series of wars designed to bring together the German states under the leadership of Prussia. In these wars, Bismarck used a combination of diplomacy to isolate his rivals and warfare to strike at them. For example, despite his support of nationalism among Germans, Bismarck helped the Russians against Polish nationalists. Russia had been an important ally of Austria, so Bismarck needed to get between the two states. He also drafted treaties with other major powers in Europe, Britain, France, and Italy, aligning them against Austria. Bismarck then stirred up war in the northern German state of Schleswig-Holstein, which had a large Danish minority. The German majority feared incorporation into Denmark and asked for the assistance of the two major German powers, Prussia and Austria. The Danish-Prussian War broke out in 1864 and did not last very long. However, it brought Austria into the war as an ally of Prussia. Bismarck subsequently manipulated the presence of Austrians to create a fear of Austrian domination in the German north. While this was manufactured, it led to tensions between Prussia and Austria. A war eventually broke out between the two German powers in 1866, and the Prussians easily defeated the Austrians over the span of 6 weeks. After the war, Austria was marginalized in German politics, and Prussia appeared as the defender of true German interests. The North German Confederation was established in 1866, marking the first appearance of a new trans-Germanic government. The Confederation had a single Reichstag which was controlled by the Prussians, although it had representatives from all the German states involved. The only German states not a part of this new organization were the southern states close to France. These states had always been friendly with Austria and would need a different motivation to join the Confederation under Prussian leadership. Again, Bismarck manipulated one of his rivals, this time the Emperor of France Napoleon III. Prussia tricked the French into invading the southern German states in 1870 as an act of war, and the southern states sought the protection of Prussia. The combined German forces easily defeated France in 1871, and the German Empire, a single unified Germany, was proclaimed in 1871. The creation of Germany was then complete. After the Austro-Prussian War in 1866, nationalism continued to divide the Austrian Empire. The experience of 1848 reminded leaders of the divisive potential of ethnic groups in the empire. Fearing the exploitation of nationalism as a division, Austrian leaders agreed to grant Hungarians autonomy within the empire in 1867, with the agreement known as the Ausgleich. While the Ausgleich recognized the presence of national groups within the empire, it also stated that Hungarians and Germans were the leaders. In the case of Austria, nationalism was problematic. However, the motivations of nationalism, primarily the establishment of dominant nation-states, would lead Europeans to move beyond the borders of Europe to assert their power to the world. To define imperialism, it is the process by which one state, with superior military strength and a more advanced technology, imposes its control over the land, resources, and population of a less developed region. While some of these terms, such as advanced and developed, reveal how Western concepts continue to define the notions of progress, this definition serves at least as a working definition to understand the phenomenon. Other aspects of note is that imperialism is also a belief system, a belief in the importance and justification of controlling vast foreign populations and resources. There are numerous types of imperialism, but they fall into four general categories: political, military, economic, and cultural. Political imperialism constitutes one state directly controlling the population of another through the domination of indigenous leaders, for example, the British in India. In terms of military imperialism, this is simply the control of space for military purposes, such as the British and French control of islands in the Pacific as refueling station for their ships. Economic imperialism signifies the control of resources, such as the British over the oil in Iraq in the early 20th century. Lastly, Cultural imperialism is the imposition of Western ideas, for example, Christianity, on other societies in hopes of reforming them in the image of the West. These different types are not mutually exclusive and were often practiced in conjunction. Imperialism differs from the previous encounter between the West and the world from the 16th and 17th century, colonialism. Colonialism involved the resettlement of indigenous peoples and the arrival of settlers from the home country. Imperialism instead relies on the control of indigenous populations rather than their resettlement. More importantly is scale. Colonialism was small in comparison to imperialism. For example, look at the map here showing European settlements in 1772, the apex of colonial rule. Note how little of the map is controlled by Europe. Now look at the map on the next slide. This slide shows the British Empire at the end of the 19th century, revealing how imperialism made Europe a truly global power. Everything in red here is governed by the British Empire. This German political cartoon reminds us that Europeans competed with each other through imperialism. Nationalism was then another driving force, and this cartoon illustrates how different nations saw their own imperial enterprise. The top illustration is how the Germans believed they would practice imperialism, suggesting that they would bring order and discipline to the jungle. The bottom picture critiques British imperialism as a form of torture and extortion. Imperialism began in earnest in 1884 with the Congress of Berlin, at which European leaders met and divided Africa into different spheres of influence. While Britain and France took the greatest amount of territory, other states also received spheres. Also at the Congress, the rules of imperialism were established, making it important that states mark their claim by conquest or otherwise give them up to other states. This rule prevented the outbreak of war in Europe, but led to bloodshed in Africa. One last significant outcome from the Congress of Berlin was the establishment of new boundaries in Africa, but ones based on European political interests. In doing so, Europeans ignored cultural and political differences already established in Africa and created many future problems for African states. Because of the need to control territory directly, European powers turned to new technologies to aid in their conquest. Thus, technology came to signify an important difference between Europe and the world. Three technologies were the most important in the imperial enterprise: quinine, steamships, and the repeating rifle. The first allowed for Europeans to penetrate deep into the African continent, which had been previously dangerous due to malaria. Quinine is a prophylactic against the disease. The second invention, the steamship, permitted Europeans to navigate upriver against the current of most African rivers. This led to the rapid conquest of the inner areas of Africa. And the third, let's turn to the next slide. The repeating rifle allowed a small force of men, such as this rifle squad, to kill many other men in short order. The machine gun shown here could pacify many soldiers. The Congolese, however, attempted to fight back. Yet Leopold's army, consisting of other African groups, was ruthless in its persecution of the Congolese and operated with impunity thanks to Leopold's dictates. Torture was commonplace, and Congolese caught attempting to destroy rubber plants were mutilated, and the army was paid for the number of hands they collected. Eventually, word got out how Leopold was treating the Congolese, which did not fit the idea of the civilizing mission, and other European states took control of parts of Congo as punishment, but they did not liberate the Congolese. In all, over 1 million Congolese are believed to have perished under the rule of Leopold II. The Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers in South Africa, were established prior to the arrival of the British in the 1880s. The Boers had created a plantation society which included slavery, but the British had outlawed slavery in their empire in 1808. Thus, the Boers would have to give up their property to live under British law. Instead, the Boers engaged in a war against the British with the tacit support of the Germans, who had interest in controlling South Africa. The British had difficulty fighting the Boers and used methods such as concentration camps to control the population. Eventually, the British agreed on a system of racial segregation, known as apartheid, that created a two-tiered system based on race. The Boer War reveals how the imperial powers did encounter resistance. Nevertheless, this map from 1914 shows how quickly Europeans conquered the African continent, especially when compared with the map on slide 8. This conquest reinforced notions of superiority and led many Europeans to emphasize the importance of the civilizing mission, with the experiences of Congo and South Africa aside, as the defining idea of imperialism. The civilizing mission typically meant four things: education, railroads, medicine, and Christianity. These four things were held up as benefits for indigenous peoples, but also, of course, benefited the imperial powers. They were symbolic of the efforts to define civilization as solely Western, with all other cultures seen as backwards. These different aspects of the civilizing mission came together in India once it was integrated into the British Empire. The British had been there since the 18th century, but it had been controlled by a private company until 1857, when an uprising led the British government to intervene to protect economic interests. This intervention also led to the imposition of British ideas on the Indian subcontinent, including the liberal celebration of the free market. India then was a laboratory for the free market principles that were popular in Britain. Thus, anything that conflicted with the marketplace was to be removed. This included granaries, which were reserves of foodstuffs and were interpreted as an effort to manipulate the market. Food stores were then dismantled. But the British did not understand the environment of India and its weather cycles, and in 1877 a drought came. Without foodstuffs, Indians were reliant on the marketplace. But with the drought, the cost of food soared, leaving many Indians vulnerable to starvation. Between 1877 and 1879, during the drought, nearly 8 million Indians died of starvation and disease, even though food was available but too expensive for them to afford.